I was asked to say something about a relatively new form of populism, or a new area where populism has spread. Of course, populism is an age-old game, and when I grew up, it was really a sport dominated by Latin America. But you know, we have some new players. Russia in the basically mid-noughties. So I think if you look at what Putin did in the first Putin administration, was not really populist. There was genuine economic reform and massive improvements in material living standards and so on. But something happened in the second Putin administration. But maybe, and here's, I can draw very much on where Peter ended. Peter ended with this image of Orban and Kaczynski, and I think that's what I'm going to focus on. How could this happen? So it's really about less about Russia. We can come back to Russia in the discussion, but it's more about Central Europe. How could these countries that had made this transition into democracy and functioning market economies, how could they turn in this direction? And I think I'm not the only one who asks that question. So what I'm going to argue is that this is really a tale of two crises. It's the crisis of the initial transitional recession, and it's the crisis that came after the global financial crisis. I'm going to focus on sort of an economic perspective on this, and I'm not at all claiming that economics can exhaust this. I'm also going to approach it more from a policy maker's perspective, because I haven't really done a lot of personal research on this, but I have some data I think can probably help you think about what happened in Central Europe. So I'm going to provide some observations, and then I'm going to try to end with sort of a framework for how to think about this, at least as an economist. So here we have the two crises. So the initial transitional recession, this is just Central Europe and the Baltics, but if you took the former Soviet space, you would see that this transitional recession was much deeper and much longer than this shows. And the second one were more or less the same, I would say, for both Central Europe and the former Soviet Union. So let me focus first on the transitional recession. So I'm going to rely here on data that when I was at the EBRD, we were fortunate enough to build this data set. It was one of the first things that I managed to do, was to build a survey that combines a household survey and an attitudinal survey. And this is the kind of things you can't really do anywhere else than in these international financial institutions. We had 36,000 interviews with households, individuals in households. So it has been running for 3 rounds, and the timing of those fits very nicely with the story that I would like to tell. So basically what they showed, and the first round showed, was that people in Eastern Europe were much unhappier than people in Western Europe, but particularly they were much unhappier than people in other countries at similar levels of GDP. And I think what we observed about unhappiness or life satisfaction or dissatisfaction in these countries is really a precursor of what was to come later on. There were some elements there that were inspiring and gave hope. Was that, unlike in Western Europe, most people said that our children would do better than we did. And so there was some sense that things were moving in the right direction. That's probably not so true any longer, and I'll show that later on. So there's a very good paper by Sergei Gurev and Katya Zhuravskaya that tries to explain this first round of observations of the Life in Transition survey. They're using also some other data. But what's interesting is that they basically can explain most of this from 2 level effects and 2 shocks. So the level of GDP and the level of public services, not very surprising, but the 2 shocks are quite important. And so it's the volatility in GDP. So people don't like insecurity very much, and that will be a core thread through what I will want to say. And the other one, which is sort of related, but it's a shock to human capital. So a lot of human capital that was valuable under socialism suddenly does not become valuable, or the fundamental change of relative prices and depreciation for various skills and so on. And so those four effects together explain basically all the countries. Hungary is actually the only country that really doesn't well explain. So that's all I was going to say about the transitional recession. Come to the global financial crisis. So the global financial crisis, of course, started elsewhere, and it hit with a little bit of a lag, but very little lag, because they were financially very integrated into the Western European banking system in particular, and also had built up a lot of trade dependency. And here are just some sort of measures that we could get from this Life in Transition survey. So what was the responses of households to this drop in consumption? Well, they reduced staple foods to a much greater extent than people did in Western Europe. They reduced consumption of luxury goods, a little bit more than people in Western Europe. But maybe what's most striking, and really what struck me when looking at this data, is people skipped hospital visits, and they deliberately economized on managing their health, and of course they delayed payments, which is maybe less surprising. So the shocks were approximately the same size, but they had very different impact on people's households. And why is that? Well, first of all, the sort of initial shocks, because of these vulnerability of these systems, the job losses, bankruptcies, and wage reductions and so on were greater. These official safety nets were not really around, so you couldn't fall back on unemployment insurance, or at least to a much less extent than in Western Europe. The informal borrowing was quite widespread and effective, but it was widespread, but it was less effective and quite costly. And of course, a lot of countries had also very large borrowings in foreign exchange by the household sector, particularly for mortgages. So that was something that really hit the household. So what were the impact on attitudes? Well, here's attitudes towards democracy. I agree this is, there are a lot of issues around asking that question, but over time, maybe comparisons are still somewhat meaningful. And what you see here is comparing now the 2006 and the 2010 rounds of the Life in Transition survey. You see that in the 2006, there was a bit more support for democracy in the Western Balkans and in Turkey than in the new EU members, and a bit more in the new EU members than in the former CIS. But if you look what happened to 2010, massive drop particularly in the new EU members, and a significant drop also in the Western Balkans and Turkey, while in the CIS and Georgia and Mongolia, you actually saw an increase in support for democracy. Here is support for markets. Again, we can have all kinds of questions about what that kind of question really tells you, but again, comparing over time, you see massive fall in support of markets in new EU members. You see in the Western Balkans a little bit of, but in CIS, Georgia, and Mongolia, actually an increase in support for markets. So what can explain this? Well, basically there are three key drivers. The first one is that basically the new EU countries were hit harder than former CIS because they were more integrated in the world economy, both financially and through trade. That's not so hard to understand. But maybe more interesting, those countries that had a very deep crisis in the early 90s, this long and very deep transitional recession that most countries in the former Soviet Union experienced, they actually view this as a smaller crisis. So there was some kind of shock resistance or resilience in these households. The third one, though, is I think also quite important to understand if you want to talk about populism, is that people, when they saw this shock and they saw this deterioration in the economic conditions, they said, what kind of systems do we have? Well, the countries that were most advanced in terms of introducing markets and democracy, they blamed the markets for not having a job or for not being able to pay your bills. They blamed the markets, while people who lived in former Soviet Union, in Georgia and Mongolia and so on, they said, actually, we don't have enough markets. This is actually the responsibility of those state institutions that still play such an important role. So I think this is you're starting to begin to see a story here that could emerge. So this was comparing the 2006 and 2010 round. So the next round was in 2014. And now we had a little bit more information that we can use, which were sort of health related. And one thing that really hits you when you look at this data is that it's not only about perceptions, it's very much about things that are real. So if you look at the kind of transition cohort, people who are born around the beginning of transition, they today are 1 centimeter shorter than those that were born before and after. And that's essentially the same effect as you get from living in a conflict zone. So these people actually went through something very real, and that we should not forget that it happened. When you look at life satisfaction, these countries have now caught up with what you would expect given their level of income. And but what you also see is that more than half of the population in these countries has not seen a closing of the gap to Western Europe. So yes, some people, and you can see maybe here, this is how different percentile or in the income distribution has done since 1989. And you can see people at the top distribution, so those people that earn the most, they have benefited tremendously from, or very significantly. So they have had earnings increases of 100%, while when you look at those at the bottom, they have done much worse. And if you look at the first period that we looked at, 1999 to 1996, you can see that they basically all lost, and all percentiles lost in that period. So it was a very significant impact. Here you have Russia, actually. In Russia, it's interesting, the scales on the vertical axis are different now, because so before it was slightly close to 100%. Here you can see the best, the highest percentile, or the highest decile, they have almost increased by 200%. So that shows you something of what happened in Russia, which is different from what was happening. Here's another way of showing this. So let me finalize or end the story with a paper that I think is the best paper in economics on this topic. It's a paper by Luigi Giso and a couple, or actually 3 co-authors. And what they try to understand is the demand and supply of populism. And you'll see in a minute why I think this is highly relevant for the story I've been trying to tell. So populism, the way they see it, and this may be a very narrow economist-like way of thinking about populism, but I think it captures quite a lot. So basically what they say populism is about. It's about providing short-term protection against globalization, against all kinds of economic shocks, independent of the long-term effects for the economy. So again, very narrow perhaps, but I think it captures quite a lot still of what populism is about. And most of the paper is about the demand for populism. And what they show, and quite convincingly, that you can explain a lot of the demand for populism from basically 2 things. One is the direct effect that comes from a decline in economic security. So again, this volatility in economic conditions, and the drop in the trust in political parties. But there's also this indirect effect, which is often confused with sort of a cultural effect. But it's actually also there's a strong economics interpretation, which is the indirect effect actually of the fall in security or economic insecurity drives also the trust in political parties. So when you take those things together, you can actually explain a lot of the demand for populism as we have seen it. This is, again, actually, this is data mostly for Western Europe. And then they look at supplier protectionism, and they say, so when do we see populist parties emerging? Well, it's when these demand accumulates over time. It takes, often there's a lag, and I think this lag we saw it in Eastern Europe, we have seen it in Western Europe, and we're seeing it now in the United States. But in which countries is it most likely to show up? Well, according to the data that they are using, it's in countries that have weak checks and balances and where political fragmentation is high. And going back to Peter's last slide, I think that's exactly my concern, and what drove my interest in these issues is that the institutions in these countries are much weaker, much more fragile. The political spectrum is very fragmented, political parties are very weak, and the checks and balances are extremely weak, and we see that already now that they are being even weakened more by this. So let me summarize. So all that I have to say really comes out of these two serious shocks. They affected life satisfaction and attitudes, like trust, attitudes to democracy, attitudes to markets. But they also affected real things, like health and height, for example, of people. They fed populists with a lag, as I think we observed elsewhere, but that was certainly true in Eastern Europe. And demand for populism came from a decline in economic security and trust in parties. And all this could also be, all this decline in trust in parties also emanated from this increased volatility, increased insecurity economically. Finally, the supply for populism came in countries with weak checks and balances and political fragmentation. And when you look around now, that's exactly the countries we're talking about, the countries that have, in a sense, changed the most, but have where the institutions are most fragile. Thank you very much.